Hello and welcome to Subversive Radio. I'm your host, Keith Childs. Hey, thanks for listening, by the way. I really do appreciate it. I have gotten some really great feedback from people who've been listening to the blog, and thank you. Thank you. Really, really appreciate it. Hey, I wanted to do this is something actually I've been meaning to do a podcast on for a long, long time, and then someone asked this question. It's a kind of a Bible verse that I think most of us have read, and probably read it and said, what? What the heck does that mean? And I've been meaning to address it for a long, long time, but other things kind of came up that I felt were more important, or more pressing, or frankly more interesting to some people. But since my friend on Facebook asked the question, then I saw a bunch of confusion about, well, I think it means this, and I think it means that. I thought, you know what, I probably need to go ahead and do it, because it kind of reminded me that I needed to do it. So I'm going to do it. Here I go. All right. So it's in 1 Timothy chapter 2. And the verse in itself that kind of makes everybody go, what? Is 1 Timothy chapter 2 in verse 15. Now, if I just read the verse by itself, it says this. Out of context, just completely by itself, here's the verse. Paul says, "But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety." Okay? Now, I have heard so many different crazy theories about what that verse means. And I'm going to tell you, before I tell you what this does mean, I'm going to tell you what it doesn't mean. First thing is that it doesn't mean, Paul is not saying that women will be saved by having babies, okay? Believe it or not, a lot of Christians, a lot of pastors, a lot of teachers, Bible teachers, will say exactly that. They might, hedge it this way or, twist it that way a little bit to kind of like shoehorn this into some crazy theological thing. But it's really weird. Let's just admit it. It's really, really a weird statement. Why is Paul saying that women are going to be saved through bearing children? I mean, is he trying to say that men are saved by faith in Christ, but women are saved by having babies? So what if you're a woman who can't have children? Now, again, what I just said was he's not saying that. Paul is not saying that women are going to be saved by having babies. But like I said, I've heard pastors say that. I've heard actually what they try to do is try to make that verse about women sort of as womankind, the female race, the female gender, if you will. The female gender will be saved by bearing children, and the process of bearing children in women is what led Eve to give birth to mankind, and that prophecy in Genesis about, the serpent biting your heel but crushing his head, and something in Revelation, and therefore it's about Jesus. Now, let me tell you something. If Paul meant all of that, he would have said all of that. He would have, and he certainly would not have dropped it in the middle of an entire chapter where he's giving instructions for women. See, in verse 9, he says, "I want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves, not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothing, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God." And then he says, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission." And he says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be silent or be quiet." Okay? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he says, "And women will be saved by having children." That sure sounds like none of those other things are metaphorical. None of those other things are these big, women are symbolic for womankind, and the female gender is what the process of birth that brought about the Messiah, and then that's the way that women are going to be saved. Well, that's how everyone's going to be saved, not just women. It just seems, that is not what he's saying. It's really, really dumb. Please don't let anybody tell you that that's what that verse means. You might, on one level, you might say, does it matter? Well, yeah, it kind of does matter, because if you don't explain it, it has Paul saying something that sounds either A, really, really stupid, or B, very, very sexist. that women are only saved if they're having babies. In other words, they're only worth something, or they're only redeemable if they have children. And otherwise, if you're a barren woman, you're made to feel less than human, less than a woman, and not able to even to be saved. That's another way that verse could be used to really cause a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering and anguish for women who can't have children or who aren't married. Okay, so let's talk about what it does mean, okay? Sorry, I wet my whistle. All right. So I'm going to just go in and say on the outset that this verse was a complete mystery to me until I read something written by my friend John Zenz. John Zenz has a book, which if you don't have, you need it. It's called What's with Paul and Women. And I'm not sure, but I think I might have had an influence on that title much, maybe not. But I know that when John was still writing the book, he sent me a copy of it and we discussed possible titles. And at any rate, anyway, it's a great, great, great book. And did I say it was great? It's great. And it really deals with Paul's, the main passages in the New Testament where Paul appears to be dissing women and putting women in a corner and telling them, teaching that women cannot speak in church and they're not allowed to teach and that kind of thing, which is not at all what Paul is doing. So that's why you need to go get that book, What's with Paul and Women. But in the process of discussing how to explain 1 Timothy chapter 2, which contains the verse that I just read, where 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12, where Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. He explains the meaning of what Paul really means in that verse. And in the process of explaining that verse, he explains that entire chapter. And that's what I'm going to tell you right now. Okay? So here you go. With apologies to John Zenz, because I'm taking this from his book. But here it is. So here's what we know. The letter, 1 Timothy, was written to Timothy by Paul when Timothy was in Ephesus. And it's about the church that was meeting in Ephesus. Okay? Here's something else we know about Ephesus at that time. Ephesus was the hub of Artemis worship. Artemis was a pagan goddess, and the temple of Artemis was located in Ephesus, and it was one of the wonders of the world at the time. It's not there anymore, but it was described as this unbelievably huge and ornate and beautiful temple. Okay, so you couldn't live in Ephesus and not notice the temple of Artemis and not be surrounded with a lot of people all over the place worshiping Artemis. It was kind of one of the biggest things going on in Ephesus. Okay, so here's something about Artemis worship that you may not know, but that the people that were in the church in Ephesus definitely did know. Okay, first century Christians in Ephesus were very well acquainted with what I'm about to tell you. Artemis worship, it was a female-dominated cult. So it not only taught that women were over men and had power over men and authority over men, it was run by women, of course. So you had female priests who did all the teaching and all the talking, and men were subjugated to women in the Artemis cult. Okay? That's one thing. Keep that in mind when we go back and read 1 Timothy 2 again. And then some things are going to make sense to you. Okay? The other thing was, because it was a female cult, sort of a female-driven cult, and Artemis was a goddess, one of the main things that Artemis promised to do for women was to be with them through the process of childbirth. We're getting closer to the truth. So, in other words, when women got pregnant, back then especially, when a woman got pregnant, there was all kinds of chances that her baby would die during the birth. So in other words, a very good chance that, first of all, that she wouldn't get pregnant at all. Second, if she did get pregnant, that the baby might miscarry and not make it to a full term. Third, that even if she had the baby could be born dead, or the baby could die very soon after birth. Its an infant mortality rate was pretty high in the first century. And then the fourth thing that could happen is that the mother could die in childbirth. That the mother could die in childbirth. Yes. And so women, as part of the hugely popular Artemis cult, which was quite prominent in Ephesus at the time of Paul's writing this letter to Timothy. One of the ways that women would show their affection and show their devotion to Artemis was to adorn their hair, to braid their hair, to put gold and silver and jewels and beautiful things that they would purchase and stick in their hair. And the more ornate and beautiful that their hair was, that was one of the ways that they gave honor to Artemis and let Artemis know that they were putting their trust in Artemis, that Artemis was going to protect them and their child in childbirth. I hardly believe that I need to connect those last two dots for anybody at this moment. But just in case you haven't connected everything I just said with what Paul is saying in 1 Timothy chapter 2, let me read 1 Timothy chapter 2 for you again. Where should we begin? Well, let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. Let's start reading in verse 8. Paul says, "Therefore I want the men everywhere, to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing." Verse 9, "I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves, not with elaborate hairstyles, or gold, or pearls, or expensive clothing, but adorn themselves with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God." Notice that Paul is making a distinction between women who don't dress modestly, who adorn themselves with elaborate hairstyles, who put gold and pearls in their hair and wear gold and pearls and wear expensive clothes. And he contrasts those kinds of women with women who profess to worship God. Because the women who are wearing the elaborate hairstyles and clothing and gold and pearls, etc., are worshiping who? Artemis, because they're in Ephesus. Verse 11, Paul says, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission." Let me remind you, a lot of the women, and possibly even a lot of the men, who were very familiar with the way Artemis worship went in Ephesus, at the temple to Artemis, would have been used to coming together for a time of worship, for a religious experience with other people who are devoted to a religious belief system. And what they were used to seeing was men sitting quietly and women doing all the talking. And women dressing with elaborate hairstyles, with women with expensive clothing and adorned with gold and pearls, etc. So, Paul's instruction to Timothy is to instruct the people at the church in Ephesus. Verse 8, "Men, I want you to pray. I want you to lift up your holy hands without any anger, without any disputing." In other words, don't argue with me. Don't dispute about this. Men, go ahead and pray. You are deputized in the body of Christ, men, to lift your hands up and to pray. Women, do not walk around dressed like those who worship Artemis, but instead adorn yourselves with good deeds. And instead of wearing expensive clothing, elaborate hairstyles, etc., adorn yourselves appropriately for those who profess to worship God, not Artemis. Now that's when, in John Zinn's book, he gets to the part about in verse 12 where Paul says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." John makes a point here that in verse 11 and in verse 12, Paul switches from talking about women in verse 9 and verse 10, meaning women, I'm talking about all the women. And in verse 11 and 12, he switches to talking about, a woman. So that it's very likely that there was a particular woman in the church in Ephesus, perhaps a woman who was at one time in the leadership of the Artemis cult, who was used to doing all the talking and all the teaching and all the training and everything else because she was a quote-unquote priestess or a leader or at least part of a female-led religion where she as a woman was allowed to do, take the reins, if you will. Okay. Understand as well that in the first century ecclesia, no one was permitted to take the reins, quote unquote. Everyone was supposed to be submissive to each other. So that Paul's instruction here in verse 11 and 12 to Timothy is that woman needs to learn to learn in quietness and in submission, and that woman is not allowed to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be quiet. Okay? And then he makes a point about how Adam was formed first and then Eve, and that Adam was not the one who was deceived, but it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. That point, the reason why Paul is making that point is that in the Christian story, which we get, carries forward from the Jewish story, is that in creation, Adam was the one formed first, and Eve was made out of Adam. Paul's point there is, again, to contrast that belief with the Artemis belief. In the Artemis belief, it was the woman who was made first. There's some weird pagan thing about how Artemis had a twin brother, Apollo, and so they were twins in the womb, but Artemis was the firstborn. She was born first, and then secondly came Apollo, which is why Artemis is has more authority over men, because she came first. She was the firstborn. That's why Paul is making that point in verses 13 and 14. And now we come to verse 15, which, now that we understand what the Artemis cult is all about, we understand how worship in the Artemis cult looks like, we understand why women in Ephesus were worshiping Artemis, because of this issue of dying in childbirth, or their child dying to being born stillborn, or infant mortality rates, or even women dying themselves through the process of having children. And then we come to verse 15, and Paul says this, but women will be saved. Notice he switches back to women. And previously he said a woman. But now at the end he says, but women, meaning all the women, will be saved through childbearing. Meaning, women will be saved. They and their children will be taken care of. They will be cared for. They will be protected through the process of being pregnant, getting pregnant, being pregnant, and having children, through the childbearing process, if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety, as they follow Christ. So again, if you understand all that background, which we don't have, right? Again, these are letters that Paul was writing in context to a single person. Paul was writing to Timothy, talking about some things he wanted to remind the church in Ephesus about. These are things that Paul didn't need to spell out to Timothy, because Timothy knew current events. Timothy probably had already told Paul in a previous letter or in a previous conversation, hey, Paul, this Artemis cult thing is a mess. It's really screwing up the way and confusing a lot of people in the church here. And so Paul writes the letter to say, here's what I want you to do. Here's how I want you to take care of that. And it's why, by the way, that Paul says some things in 1 Timothy 2 that he doesn't say in any of his other letters to other churches. Instructions that he does not give when he writes to the church in Rome or in Thessalonica, right? Or in the church even in Ephesians he doesn't, because he hadn't gotten to this issue, hadn't come up yet. But again, in Galatians, he doesn't write to the church in Galatia about this issue, about women usurping authority, or men not taking, a little bit of initiative to go ahead and not be afraid to raise your hands and pray out loud. So, and correcting this whole misunderstanding about how women are going to be protected through the process of giving birth. Anyway, like I said, I really recommend that you pick up that book. It's a really great book. He really does explain it a whole lot more detail, and he covers 1 Corinthians chapter 14, which is one of the other problematic verses, and I'm not going to address that here for you. I'll let you read the book. But anyway, hopefully this makes sense to you. Once you have the background of the Artemis cult, you understand that it was the Artemis cult was dead center in Ephesus. It was one of the wonders of the world. The temple of Artemis was one of the wonders of the world. And this is what Artemis worship looked like. Women, predominantly women, led by women, taught by women, the women who are part of the cult adorning their hair with gold and silver and braiding, things into their hair to show their affection and their devotion to Artemis, so that they will be saved and their children will be saved through the process of childbirth, etc. Now that you know all that, go back and read 1 Timothy 2, and it'll totally make sense. I hope all that made sense, and I thank you for listening. We will continue to do podcasts from now till doomsday, until someone stops me or they shut off my internet or something. But I thank you for listening. Again, thank you for listening. We will do another one. Hey, if you have an idea for a podcast, you have a question or a topic you'd like me to cover, please send me a note. Let me know what it is you'd like me to cover, whether that's on house church, maybe it's a Bible difficulty or question, I don't know, testimony, something about our house church, about caring for the poor, about the motel church that we've been doing for like 12 years. Anything, really, just let me know. Let me know you're out there and that you're listening and that you care. Let me know you care. Thank you. I'm okay. All right. Anyway, I think we're done, and we will talk again soon. God bless. Good night, and let the kingdom come.